And I would like to say, first of all, thank you for joining us. It's very exciting to have you here. Helen and I have been truly looking forward to presenting today. And what this is going to be is hopefully more of a conversation than a presentation, where the two of us are going to be talking about writing as a method of and for research. And what we would like to do is really to go through the different sort of elements of writing. We are obviously starting with introducing ourselves, first of all, but then we will be setting the scene of what is writing, what does writing look like, and then moving on to the 4 purposes of writing, and going into detail with all of those. And then we are obviously concluding, and after the conclusion, there'll be plenty of time for you to raise any questions. Having said that, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat box of the Zoom or of the Rover app, and we will try and respond to those as we go along, perhaps where they fit. And if not, we will be responding to those afterwards. One thing that we would like to kind of start off with is really to say that both of us are actually quite enjoying the process of writing in many different ways. But I'll be honest, I've not actually always enjoyed that. So that's not necessarily something that's come naturally to me, if you like. I don't know about you, Helen, whether you felt that that's something that's come naturally to you.
I have always loved writing, but it took a while before I got any good at it. But I've always loved it. Even as a child, I used to write stories all the time. And yeah, it's always been a bit of a passion.
Thank you. So I think what we want to start off with, first of all, is actually introducing ourselves. Helen, if you want to start introducing yourself, because this slide demonstrates the 2 book covers and yours is on the left. So as we're reading from left to right, you're on mute.
Talk about rookie error. I'm an independent researcher and scholar, and I've been writing academic books for about 10 years now. And this is possibly the one that is closest to my heart of all of my books. It's not by much, but it's one I'm really fond of, because I've been a creative writer. What we think of as a creative writing, and I'll talk about this more in the presentation, so I don't want to anticipate that too much. But just briefly, I think that the distinction between creative writing and other forms of writing is overplayed. I think there are far more similarities than differences, and there's a great role, particularly within social research, for what we think of as creative writing, so fiction techniques, poetry techniques, and so on. But like I say, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. The book came out in January, so it's quite new, and we try very hard in the book to not only talk the talk, but also, as it were, walk the walk and model. You can't really say embody, can you, when it's in a book? But to maybe you can, to kind of embody the messages that we're trying to convey in the work that we produce. And I loved writing this book. I loved working with Richard. Richard is a geography professor at the University of Sheffield, and he asked me to write this book with him. And it was the best thing anybody's ever asked me to do, ever, ever, ever. So that was great. Yeah.
Thank you very much. That's great to hear. I mean, to be honest, I've had a similar experience with my own book, Making the Most of Your Research Journal. This came about because when I started my own PhD, so just to say that I'm not a newbie in the world, but I am a relatively new researcher in terms of doctorate and academic work. And I came to academia as a second or even third career, if you like. When I started on the PhD journey, I was adamant that my research journal would be perfect and brilliant and exciting, and it would be effective, and it would have all of the most and best qualities of any research journal ever found. And I looked around, and the book that I wanted wasn't available to buy. I just didn't find what I was after. And I said, it was literally, I started my PhD in September, and I had my first supervisory meeting in late September, beginning October. And I said to my doctoral supervisors, I don't find the book that I want about research journaling. I think I'm going to have to write that myself. So here I am now, several years later, having finished a PhD. I actually sat down to write this book. So I'm really excited about having been able to put this together. And it is about, you know, the concept of writing and research journaling. And it's not just about writing, it's actually that it's a lot more, which brings us quite smoothly into our first kind of slide that we have prepared today, which is setting the scene, what he's writing. So Helen, do you want to pitch in here what he's writing for you?
Well, this is an interesting question that we don't stop to think about, because we all know what writing is. But actually, if you take a step back from the we all know, as researchers, we need to do this in a lot of different contexts, and I think this is one valuable one. And think about what writing actually is. In one sense, you can come up with a definition, like it's putting words on pages or screens, writing with a pen or with a keyboard. It's an activity, it's a task, it's this, it's that, it's the other. But actually, writing is quite a complex thing. It can be regarded as a solo activity or relational. Arguments are made for both of those. The boundary between writing and drawing is something we're going to talk about in a minute or two, but writing is not always just about words or fonts or print or etc., etc. There are lots of ways that writing can be defined, and this increases the flexibility of how writing can be used in some quite useful ways. Nicole, do you want to add anything to that?
Thank you. I think we move on to kind of what does writing look like, because you've kind of already hinted at that actually writing is a lot more than just putting full sentences in pleasurable prose, if we like. So really, what does writing look like? To me, there is a lot to be said about the boundary between writing and drawing, but also about playful working with words. So if I'm just going to move on to our next slide to kind of give an example from the book, but basically just to show what writing actually may look like. On the left here, on that image, this is a word cloud that I created as quite early on in my PhD journey, where I was trying to make sense of where I'm sitting with my creative approaches to research. And, you know, but somebody else looking at this probably doesn't mean much other than, you know, well, there are some words thrown up, but that's it. To me, that was quite an important way of making sense of my experience. And that's really what writing is about. It's not just about writing full sentences. It's actually about trying to experience and make sense of what it is that you see and experience. And then on the right-hand side, there is another example. That's in a way that was also writing, but this was planning for a fictionalization. Now, obviously, we're coming back to that a little bit later anyway, but it's, again, that this kind of writing is not necessarily in full sentences. It's more about putting ideas down and trying to organize ideas in your own mind. And I think that's quite an important way. But I know that you've got something to add, Helen, about writing in different cultures as well.
Yes, I think, well, we can talk about writing and drawing in this context as well, because you've just shown those lovely images, which I think are very visually appealing in different ways. And there is a question about the boundary between writing and drawing, which, I mean, I have a tattoo. I don't know if you can probably, if you can quite see it on the screen, possibly not. I'm slightly at the wrong angle, but there are words on my arm. So is that writing? I mean, people can read what it says, but it's engraved into my skin with ink. Is that writing? The Vanuatu people use sound drawings with their conversations to emphasize and to embellish the verbal elements of their conversation. They will literally draw in sand or in some other fine material like ash, perhaps, or dust, that is transient and can blow away with the wind, but it's part of their communication process and they're using an implement or a finger to make those marks. So are they drawing? Are they writing? It's a very interesting question. And the more you explore it, the more interesting I think it gets. And I think this question about cultures is really interesting too, because I'm born and brought up and have always lived in the UK. And the UK is a very writing dependent culture. We place great importance on writing. We have written legislation, written statutes, written laws, written documents of all kinds. People write their will and testament for what they want to happen to their belongings after they die. Our children write lists for Santa at Christmas. You know, there are many, many ways in which writing is really essential to our culture. And yet there are cultures in the world that don't use writing at all and have no need for writing and function every bit as well culturally as the UK culture. Some would quite legitimately argue function better, although that's not necessarily simply because of the lack of writing. I think there are many other aspects and factors to that. But writing is clearly not essential for humanity, because much of humanity manages perfectly well. You know, big chunks of humanity manage perfectly well without writing, have no need of it, and can function entirely as societies and as individuals in that way. So writing looked at globally is a really complex thing. It's not simple, it's not straightforward. Nicole, let me come to you for a minute.
Well, I was just liking to kind of add to that. In terms of writing, we also have to think back that there were particular times in history where writing was limited to quite an elite kind of society, and it wasn't everybody's thing to be able to write. So actually, in a way, we have to, and I think that's why you know, sometimes we do find writing quite difficult even nowadays, because we've got particular expectations of what writing has to look like and what we want it to be, and it has to kind of represent this scholarly and in-depth experience, and it has to be highly academic and analytical. And actually, in a way, we should, you know, be satisfied that we can write a shopping list, and sometimes that's quite an important thing to write. So it's, you know, we are privileged enough to actually be able to write in the way that we are. And I think that goes now kind of moving on to the next sort of slide that we've prepared, where we're talking about the purposes of writing. And I think this is really what's important, is trying to understand that all writing obviously comes with a particular purpose, and in a way we should try and identify that we're writing for different purposes.
Yeah, absolutely. And writing as a research method, I mean, this is something I've been arguing for a long time, is that writing is a research method, and it's often not treated as such. And if you find a textbook on research methods, it may well not include anything about writing. And yet show me a researcher in the Euro-Western paradigm who can do their project without writing, and I will be astonished, because I don't think it's possible. And this applies to quantitative researchers just as much as qual, because in quant research, you can't just present tables, graphs, equations. You have to give a narrative, and that has to be done in writing. So one of the purposes of writing is for research. Writing is very much for research, but it has other purposes too that I think you had listed on the previous slide that we've just switched away from. That's it. There you go. Do you want to talk about the second?
Yeah, so
there, Nicole, that's yours.
So as part of writing for and as research, I'm trying to make a point that actually it's also to organize and plan, and it's not just about organizing and planning the research project, which is most of the time where research journaling comes in. Actually, you know, writing can help us plan our careers, and that's something that I'm going to be talking about a little bit later as well. And then we do have, both of us have got example of creative research writing as well for today.
Yeah, we'll come to those in a minute. But there's lots of ways writing can be used for research. I mean, we've just used 4 examples here with logs, diaries, journals, and field notes, but there are many others. You know, emails. Let's talk about emails. We write emails all the time when we're doing research. And just finally to say that writing isn't only a task, it's also potentially a resource for us. And I'll say a bit more about that in a little while, but I know that Nicole is going to talk now in more detail in a minute about writing for research. It can be, whether it's a task or a resource, it can be for ourselves as researchers and of course for the people we're doing research with. And again, there are lots of different ways in which writing for research can be done. But field notes are a particularly interesting one because most researchers use field notes of some kind, at least most researchers who do any kind of field-based research. Some do it more formally than others. Some are more ad hoc about it. But generally, we keep notes of things because we know we can't trust our memories. Nicole, do you want to say a little bit more about field notes?
Yeah, so I'm particularly keen to kind of explain how we can use research journals in terms of writing and dealing with field notes, because a lot of the time when we're talking about keeping a research journal, nobody really tells you what to write down and how to respond and what to do with what you've done once you've written something. And I'm trying to make a point that actually there are 3 different levels of interpretations, and that's we have to across our research journaling, in order to make the most of the journaling and the writing process, we really have to tap into all of these 3 levels at one point or another. We don't have to do it with every single entry, but it's really important to hit all of those in levels of interpretations. So kind of the first thing really is describing. So it's where you just basically describe what you've seen, what you've heard. It's a very factual account of what's going on. The second level of interpretation is then the detailing, where you add a little bit of detail, where you're already like starting to interpret. For example, somebody may say they have grinned at you, and you could say, well, this grin was a smirk, or this grin was a friendly grin. So this is the kind of interpretation, the first level of interpretation that starts to happen. And then the third level really is where you reflect back and you go and look back at old entries, and you're going back to start analyzing what's going on, and actually also bring in theories and use those to build on your initial descriptions and your detailing. So there are different ways of dealing with that. But at the same time, and I think this is the part that's really exciting, is if we are worried about not having written something down and suddenly we realize, 3 months ago, there was this conversation that was really important and I didn't record it in my journal, we don't need to panic. There are strategies that we can use through writing vignettes or critical incidents, for example, that will help us deal with that. So writing for research, like you say, is not just about writing for ourselves and for our co-workers and keeping a memory, but it's also providing us in a way with new data as well.
Yes, absolutely. And many researchers do explicitly make field notes thinking, I will use these later in an analytic way. And some researchers like to keep 2 separate journals, one for public use as data and one for private reflection and expression. And that's fine too. You don't have to do really any of this stuff, but this is about offering you some options so that you can think about what might work for you, what you want to take from this for your own work. There's no real rules. This is one of the great things about taking creative approaches to research. Well, 1 or 2 kind of rules, but not major frameworks of rules. And so within that, there's a lot of flexibility for you to do the work you're doing in the way that's going to work best for you.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's also where the sort of the practical stuff comes in terms of organizing and planning and writing for organization and planning. Because again, a lot of the time we've got this expectation that writing has to be in full 10 sentences. And actually, like I said earlier, we're quite privileged to be able to write shopping lists. Well, in a way, those shopping lists can help us plan our research journey, our research life, and they help us remain organized, but also help us review our progress. So things like to-do lists are quite useful, because actually, it feels like at the end of the week, you've ticked off a few things. Sometimes we do so many things in between that we don't even realize that we've actually achieved something. By the end of the day, I just sometimes feel really tired and think, well, I haven't actually done anything today. And when you then go back over the to-do list and you've seen, well, actually, I have written this part of the chapter, and I have written that part of the article, and I have updated my CV, and I have updated my expenses tracker. There's all these little things that you do that actually are part of who we are as researchers and the kinds of work that we're doing. The other thing that I would like to mention at this stage is actually the role of a full CV. So in terms of my full CV at the moment stands at about 24 pages, and it's literally just every conference presentation that I do just gets a notification in there. It just gets like a line in there. Every grant application, every additional role, every guest presentation, whatever it is, everything just gets noted. And then when it comes to trying to apply for promotion, for probation, or for any kind of new job role, whatever it is, you just pick out the things that you know that are relevant for that particular role. So it's actually writing the application gets real quick, because you just have to cut and paste the things that are relevant. But most of the time we don't actually want to kind of keep our CVs updated. But I'm a very fond, I'm somebody who's really fond of keeping your CV updated. I've got a couple of examples. I know that you've got some examples as well, but these are some examples from the book as well, where it's literally just expense tracker and to-do lists. But that's kind of, you know, how we are writing in terms of practicalities and trying to organize ourselves and our research life. But I think we should come to the part that's both is exciting for both of us. Well, the most exciting part. Oh, sorry, Helen. Yes, please.
I just wanted to say a couple of things about this before we get to the really exciting part, which is that you're completely in love with doing everything by hand, and I'm completely in love with doing everything digitally. So my expenses tracker, I do write an expenses tracker. It's on a spreadsheet because it adds it all up for me, which I really appreciate. And I would also, from the previous slide where it said about systematic notes about what you read, I would really endorse that. It doesn't feel terribly creative. It doesn't feel anything other than quite boring a lot of the time. But especially if you're doing doctoral research, you read so much, you need to keep track because you can't remember. Nobody can, unless they've got some amazing photographic memory, which is a very small minority of people. And again, I find spreadsheets really useful for that. And some people will like to do that manually, and that's fine in books or on loose leaf and with colors and so on. But I like spreadsheets because you can sort them really quickly and see if you've got gaps. You know, depending on how you've set out your spreadsheet, you could sort it by date and see if you've left out any big chunks of time where there might be relevant literature that you haven't included. You can sort by topic, all sorts of things. Anyway, so that's just a little bit of advice. Your future self will thank you. If you
That's the thing, yeah, especially when you've written a long project and suddenly you're like, well, I know I've read a journal somewhere at some point, and you're trying to track down that reference on the basis of a sentence that you've taken out of the entire article.
Absolutely. So let's move on to the really exciting part, as you just called it.
That's the part that's really exciting.
Well, I don't know. I think you're doing your own work down here, because I think it's all exciting stuff, actually. And I've just noticed someone on the Padlet saying they find it hard to keep a research diary. Me too. Whoever that was, me too. I'm an ad hoc journaler at best. But let's just have a little think about what we call creative writing. I get frustrated with this because for me, all writing is creative. If you're putting words together to create a sentence that nobody else has ever written before, then that's a creative act. I don't care if you're writing about accountancy or what it is, it's still creative. However, going beyond that, the techniques of what we think of as creative writing, fiction, poetry, playwriting, screenplay writing, etc. Some of the techniques here can be really useful in research. And this can apply in all sorts of ways. At the tiny micro level, word choice. Which word, especially if you're writing in English or another language which is similarly rich in synonyms, as Nicole alluded to earlier on, where you can have a grin or a smirk or a smile or lots of different words for essentially the same sort of stretching of your mouth a bit in your face. And this is often the case that there are lots of synonyms. So which word do you choose? One person's cautious is another person's wary, is another person's timid, and these can give different sort of emphases. Or you can do macro level stuff. You can do a whole graphic novel. I'll show you some examples later of academic graphic novels. And often writing is more multivocal than we realize or expect it to be. If you look at the annual report and accounts of a business, a corporation, that's generally held to be very factual writing. It's a thing that lots of companies, I mean, often it's a legal requirement in many countries for a company to produce one every year, to report on what they've done and how much money they've made or lost. But if you look at one of those documents, it's multivocal because you have the chairperson's report, which they write or is written for them and they approve. You have the treasurer's report or the accountant's report, which is different voice again. You may have different department reporting in. So the heads of departments will give little reports on how their department's done during the year. And so there are a lot of different voices, even in these very dry, not anything most people would regard as nice bedtime reading. Although I'm talking about multivocal writing, the concept of voice in writing is a slightly complex one. As three different things, writing, reading, and speech, as it says here, are very different. But when they're written down, you may have had the experience of doing, say, an interview with a participant, then transcribing what they've said. It may have sounded very fluent when you were talking with them and listening to what they had to say, but when you see it on the page, it seems stilted with lots of speech tics and ums and ers, and the fluency appears lost. Something I think that's quite interesting, if you set out writing as if it were poetry with a bit on each line, it often seems much more fluent. And indeed, the rhythms of poetry and the rhythms of speech are much closer to each other than the rhythms of speech and prose. So this is partly why. And reading is a whole different thing again, different skill, different activity, different kind of relationship with words and stories. But every piece of writing has its own voice. Every writer has their own voice. And these are very subtle differences often. But if you think about your own voice, that's multivocal. If you're talking to your doctor, you're going to use a different voice from if you're talking to an upset 2-year-old. And you do that very naturally. We all do this very naturally as we go through our daily lives. But it applies in writing too. And understanding about how voice works and about how fiction and poetry techniques work and how they can be used in writing helps writing to be more readable, more interesting, more compelling. And surely as writers of anything, we want our writing to be compelling and interesting for our readers. Otherwise, really, what's the point? Do you want to add anything, Nicole, there?
No, I agree with you. I agree totally with what you're saying, especially the part where you're saying about multivocal writing. So, I mean, I'm moving on to the examples that we talked about earlier. And here are 2 poems that I have written, and they are both mine, but both very different. And I have created 2 things that could potentially have been written by 2 different people altogether. And I think that's the kind of the summary of what you're saying in terms of, like how actually working with what you're trying to work with the kind of framework that you're working actually also makes it a little bit more challenging and more fun, to be honest. So on the left hand here, we've got This Is Just to Say, which is a poem I've created on the basis of some experiences in higher education. And I'd just like to read that out as an example. This is just to say, I have taken the thoughts you voiced in our meeting and which you were probably saving for writing. Forgive me, they were ingenious, so noble and so bold. And what I've done there is literally just counted every single syllable in the original This Is Just to Say poem and tried to even like copy not just the amount of syllables, but also the structure of the poem. Each line was so formally constructed. It took me forever to write this. It doesn't look like it, but because it was so constrained in its form, it was actually at the same time quite therapeutic and cathartic as well.
Yes, that's really interesting. I'm just finding a link for the original that I'm going to pop in the chat in case people aren't aware of the William Carlos Williams poem, the original poem, so people can have a look.
I've plagiarized, yes.
Well, you've only plagiarized the structure, which is not actually plagiarism. It's like copying an old master. It's how we learn. But I think it's a lovely piece of work. And my comic in the middle, Conversation with a Purpose, which is a comic designed to support the teaching of qualitative interviewing. and is multivocal because it has different characters within it who have different voices. There are the interviewer and the interviewee on the front cover, but also a teacher and a friend and so on. And that's free for download from my website if anyone's interested. It's just a short 12-page comic, but it's creative writing for research. Not for a research project, for the teaching of research, but this is still very much for research. And then there's Nicole's other poem, but I think we probably need to move on fairly soon because I think we're going to run out of time if we're not careful.
Yes.
And people can read that for themselves.
Yes, that's fine. So we were talking, the final thing was going to be about writing as a resource. And I think I've kind of already mentioned that I found the writing process of this is just to say quite therapeutic and cathartic. So in a way, this is already leading us into this final slide that we've got prepared anyway. You should.
Yeah, I think writing can teach us as we write. And I think there are few writers who don't have the experience of, or certainly academic writers or serious creative writers who don't have the experience of writing something down and then thinking, oh, is that what I think? Oh, look, yes, it is actually. And learning from the writing almost as we do it. Not all the time, of course, but now and again this happens. So we can learn from the process of writing, but equally, as Nicole has said, writing can be quite therapeutic. If you have a distressing experience while you're doing research, it can be helpful to write it down. If you can't talk to anyone for support because you're in the field or because there just isn't anyone around at the time or whatever, you can write it down and write down what happened, how you felt about it. And that can be really cathartic. Or if you're coming into a research encounter with a lot of emotion of your own, whatever it may be, whether you're particularly joyful about a wonderful thing that's just happened and you want to blast it out to everyone, or whether you're upset or angry, someone just was mean to you and you're feeling really a lot of feelings in reaction to that, being able to write that down, just get it out of your being and onto the screen or the page can be hugely helpful. And writing is also, in a sense, your friend, in that it's always there for you, like a dear good friend. Also, sometimes annoying and disappointing, like many of our friends can be. I'm sure we're not like that ourselves to our friends ever. But these qualities are all there in writing. And so writing is a resource as well as a task. And Nicole will just tell us a little bit about writing as a mentor.
Yeah, but I think what I've tried to kind of say with that is that really, as you go through the processes of kind of keeping track of your achievements, keeping track of your CV, trying to see what you how you're developing as a person, as a researcher, that kind of helps you almost like a mentor does, because in a lot of the mentorship relationships, people are saying, well, what is it that you have done so far? Where do you see yourself in the future, in 5 years, 10 years? And actually doing that and through writing is quite a nice way of making sense of your own research narrative and your research career as such. I mean, we have covered a lot of stuff, so I'm just going to run through very quickly our concluding thoughts, which was really that we were trying to say how writing takes many forms and formats, that you can do writing and you can use writing, because writing is your friend, your teacher, your therapist, and your mentor. And the other thing is that both of us, we agree that there is no such thing as the perfect piece of writing. And actually, I always quote Neil Gaiman in that concept, because Neil Gaiman, so I do look a lot to fiction writers generally. I've read Stephen King's On Writing. I've read Neil Gaiman's books on writings, Philip Pullman. So a lot of the science fiction writers and crime fiction writers are actually quite useful to help us teach about the writing process. And Neil Gaiman always says, the first draft is really just for you to put it down, to have something to work with. And the second draft is the draft where you actually put it into the shape that you wanted to put it into in the first place. So it's really trying to recognize that there is no such thing as the perfect written piece, especially not from the beginning. And as such, again, everyone is saying how all writing is good writing, and that is just a step on the journey. Do you want to add anything to that, Helen, at this stage?
No, I think that's a lovely conclusion, and I think we should stop talking and stop recording. And we've got lots of comments on the Padlet and one or two in the chat. And I think we need to get to those.
Yes, I just want to, for the sake of completeness, say that our slides are available for download. I have shared the link, and in those last 2 slides, we've just put up the blurb of the books and the links to those as well. And here are our contact details once more, just in case anybody would like to get in touch with us. I'm going to stop the recording now. Oops.